Hello. On Holocaust Memorial Day, we remember all those who suffered in the Holocaust and in subsequent genocides too. This is a short film about the people who have suffered terribly in one of those subsequent genocides, the Rohingya people. And it is also about other minority groups in Burma who have similarly had to endure decades of persecution and discrimination. Shortly we will see a Rohingya photo exhibition and then hear from people closely connected to the Rohingya people and to others in Burma. There will also be a Newcastle connection to all this and other North East connections. But first, a little background. The acute problems in Burma go back to at least March 1962. That was when the military took over in the person of General Ne Win. The excuse for their takeover of the country was the unrest in ethnic minority areas after a highly centralised regime was set up once the British withdrew at the end of the Second World War. This was developed rather than a federal system, which had also been proposed. Now, when the military took over in 1962, they did so because they claimed they had to restore what they saw as law and order to the country. What this meant in practice was that many minorities in Burma, such as the Rohingyas and the Karens, the Kachins and the Shan, as well as many others, were to suffer appalling discrimination and persecution for what has now been nearly 60 years. Meanwhile, the military renamed themselves the State Law and Order Restoration Council, or SLORC for short. The Rohingyas were denied citizenship by this regime under the 1982 Citizenship Act, while the SLORC also sought to build a gas pipeline through Karen territory, which would destroy both the environment and people's homes, and featured a free fire zone around it. Vocal opponents of the regime were incarcerated in the brutal, insane prison in what was then still called Rangoon and is now called Yangon. These were just some of the many ways in which the SLORC sought to discriminate against, persecute, and let's face it, use many of the citizens of Burma. The Burmese army were using the country and its people for their own benefits, especially the leadership, who became fabulously rich, while most people stayed terribly poor. In 1988 there was an uprising after the people of Burma had had enough and found that their utter despair outweighed their fear of the military after General Ne Win had been responsible for wrecking the economy. His lucky number was 9. So all the 10 chat notes, chat being the currency of Burma, all the 10 chat notes were changed to 9 chat notes and the 100 chat notes to 90s and so on. As a result of this, the economy collapsed and people became hungry. And there was an uprising. It didn't succeed. In the subsequent crackdown after the uprising, about 3,000 innocent people were killed, and it was said that the streets of Rangoon had to be hosed down with water so deep and persistent were the blood stains. There was people's great surprise then. In 1990 there was an election, but it turned out to be no more than a ruse after the National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, more of her later, the daughter of General Aung San, the father of the Burmese nation who led the country to independence from the British in 1948, after the NLD, this National League for Democracy, had won 82% of the seats. The election had got the pro-democracy supporters out of the woodwork, and some of those elected were rewarded not with seats in Parliament, but with long prison sentences. The persecution of the minorities continued throughout the 1990s and into the 21st centuries, as groups of Burmese soldiers raided areas such as Karen State in the east of the country and Rakhine State in the west, which was the home and still is the home of the Rohingya people. By 2000, about 150,000 Karens were in refugee camps along the Thai-Burmese border, while a similar situation with the Rohingyas had developed along the border between Burma and Bangladesh. Other minorities in Burma were also regularly attacked by the huge Burmese army, which at 400,000 was 4 times bigger than the British army and was almost solely used by the generals for internal oppression. Meanwhile, leader of the pro-democracy party, the National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi, had become a great icon for human rights and seemed to be a worthy successor to the mantle of Gandhi, Martin Luther King and Mandela. It was a time of great hope and optimism, therefore, when in November 2010 Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest and elections took place in 2012, in which the pro-democracy NLD did very well. It seemed that the long nightmare of the people of Burma, especially minorities like the Rohingyas and the Karens, would soon be over. Aung San Suu Kyi was herself banned by the constitution from becoming president under the spurious condition that she'd been married to a foreigner, in effect simply to stop her becoming president. However, she took the role of state councillor, which still gave her, as leader of the NLD, an awful lot of power and influence. The real power still lay in the hands of the army generals, however, and especially General Min Aung Hlaing. So the scene was set for the terrible tragedy that began in August 2017 when the Burmese army invaded Rakhine State in the west of Burma and perpetrated a genocide that was so bad that it has been reported that a study estimated in January 2018 that the military and local Rakhine Buddhists killed at least 24,000 Rohingya people and perpetrated gang rapes and other forms of sexual violence against 18,000 Rohingya Muslim women and girls, while 116,000 Rohingya were beaten and 36,000 were thrown into fires. And during this nightmare, what did the human rights icon Aung San Suu Kyi have to say as state councillor? Well, sadly, it was little or nothing. The daughter of General Aung San found it impossible to criticise the army her father had founded. And the populist politician, who wanted to keep in with the Burman majority, had won out against the human rights icon. The nightmare for the Rohingya goes on, as do the struggles for human rights and human dignity for other minorities in Burma, such as the Karens and the Kachins. So now let us look at the Rohingya photo exhibition and see just what kind of suffering this highly marginalised group have been through and continue to have to endure.
Hello, my name's Henna and I'm a learning mentor. I work with post-16 learners who may be experiencing barriers to learning. My first experience, or my first time I heard about the Rohingya community, actually was through social media, through Facebook, and also through a charity organisation I was involved with in London. I was given an opportunity by them to actually go to Bangladesh with them, to accompany them go along with them to Bangladesh and go and help out in the refugee camp. Actually, while I was sort of getting ready and raising money to take along with us, as we were hoping to build. Well, we were totally fully in the swing of building a maternity camp, but I discovered there was a group of individuals in Newcastle that were also doing the same thing. They were trying to raise awareness, raise money, and had already supported a number of projects in Bangladesh for the Rohingya community. Which was really quite good. So I quickly got involved in that, and I thought, well, I'm a Newcastle citizen. It is certainly easier to work with people in your own hometown. I was quite fortunate because I was joined with Habib Rahman on the trip as well. So when we went over there, I don't think anything can ever prepare you for what you actually see. You see videos, you see pictures, you see all sorts, but absolutely when you arrive there, the sheer size of the refugee camp absolutely blows you away. We're talking over 1 million people spread out on a vast land, but it was just how dangerous and how squalid the whole situation was. One thing I certainly noticed, there wasn't very many women kind of moving around, although there were. But as we went to the maternity clinic, we were very fortunate enough to see some babies being born, and also listen to some of the women that had gone through some of the ordeal. A lot of the women that were giving birth had actually been victims of rape, so those children that they were giving birth to were victims of that. So that was quite sad in itself, and I think, if anybody's got a heart, anybody's got any kind of emotion, I mean, it just doesn't, I certainly was reduced to tears on a number of occasions. I was actually given an opportunity to run a program which involved play therapy to work with children who'd also been victims of trauma. There were many children out there who were unaccompanied, whose parents have been murdered, who had nobody basically. They were just living in these with strangers, so who had seen their parents get murdered, killed. One woman had told me that her husband had been beaten and made to watch her being raped, and then her child was then thrown in a fire alive, and then her husband was then shot, which I don't know how you get past that. I don't know how you get past something like that. But she had managed to escape and come over. She was pregnant, and unfortunately, she was just her mental state was, well, understandably all over the place. Some of the children that we spoke to were really struggling with seeing such violence. So the work that we had done involved them, using play therapy and art therapy to try and help them through some of that, to kind of bring some of that to the surface and out of them. Since then, since we've come, while we were there, Habib met a young girl called Salma, who was about 13 at the time. She'd been shot a number of times. I don't know how, but she managed to escape over into Bangladesh, and the charity that is based in Newcastle, who is now called RAIN, has been supporting her with her education and her medicine, and she's absolutely flourishing, which is amazing. So since my trip to Bangladesh, the organisation in Newcastle, which is called RAIN, has been tirelessly trying to raise awareness and keep it in the limelight, keep them, keep the ante up about the Rohingya plight. They haven't gone away. There's still over 1 million people in that refugee camp who have no homes, no statuses, nothing in their lives, nothing to strive for, which makes me really sad. And I think our vision as RAIN, as the people of Newcastle, is that we want to build a future. We want to give them a future and aspiration, something to live for, something to look forward to, not just live their day-to-day life, not these children that, have got no futures. That's not something that we want, and that's something that we want to work towards, and that's our vision. And that's what we would like to achieve, is to help people. And I think this year, if nothing is taught you, nothing is to be kind, and to help those that are less fortunate. And people out there, I think we're very, very lucky that we have medical services and and hospitals and whatnot around us, but over there's nothing. And you think, you know, when a baby's born and you send them back into their slums, how long is that baby going to survive? So yeah, so that's our vision. It's not just to feed them today and not just give them food parcels, but actually build a future and give them a future.
8th of November 2020. It's been a week of elections, and today's in Myanmar is one that could not be described by anyone as free and fair. Human Rights Watch has described it as fundamentally flawed. More than 2 million people were disenfranchised, including all the Rohingya people from Rakhine State. Other ethnic people in ethnic minority areas also were disenfranchised. A quarter of the seats are reserved for the army. The plight of the Rohingya, of course, has been well documented and has, I think, pricked the conscience of the world, but sadly without any resolution to their plight. Hundreds of thousands remain in refugee camps in Bangladesh, one of which, Kutupalong, is the biggest single refugee camp in the world. It's a situation without any clear path to resolution. The Rohingya, of course, have captured people's attention, but the plight of other ethnic minorities in Myanmar is perhaps not as extreme, but desperate also. I started visiting refugee camps within Thailand in 2000, and over the next few years went to 4 different camps. Those camps were for Karen refugees fleeing over the border from Karen state, and 100,000, more than 100,000 of them remain in camps today. The camps that I visited, first one Myanmar in 2000, they're still there. So the situation for those refugees remains dire. In 2019, I went teaching English again on a visit to Kachin State, to Myitkyina in Kachin State. And there some of the people I was working with again were internally displaced people. I went on a visit one day to an IDP camp, and the young man who showed me around was telling me of the problems that are afflicting people in that camp. There were about 2,500 of them in that camp, and they get an allowance of something like £8 a month to live on. Their freedom to leave the camp is restricted. He told me that there are problems of drugs in the camp brought in by outsiders, which are a big worry to the camp leaders. And he also told me that land rights is a big issue in Kachin State, where the Burmese authorities, the military, and Chinese big business also are depriving the Kachin people of the right to their land. So Myanmar remains in a desperate condition. When I arrived there in 2019, the taxi driver who took me into the centre of the of Yangon said that it was a country where the army had far too much say in civilian life, and that remains the case. So, as I say, we remember particularly the plight of the Rohingya and hope for a resolution, but there are other ethnic minorities suffering too. Here in Sunderland, we had 2 events in 2019 to try and highlight that plight. There was an exhibition in the Minster Church in the summer about the Rohingya, and then later in the year an exhibition of children's art which was produced by children from Kutupalong camp, in which they depicted their hopes and aspirations. Interesting, all of them seem to have aspirations to do something that would be of benefit not just to themselves but to their communities. They wanted to be doctors, nurses, social workers. Sadly, there's no real prospect at the moment of their plight being solved and then being able to resume normal life. But where there's life, there's hope, and let's hope that in 2021 the situation can improve. Thank you.
My name is Anne Schofield, and I am pleased through this video to speak of the plight of the Rohingya people, often described as the most persecuted people in the world. They're the largest of many Muslim ethnic and linguistic minority groups in Myanmar, which was formerly Burma, and they've lived there for over 800 years. But in recent years, with the other ethnic minority groups, they have faced decades of discrimination, loss of civic rights and repression under successive, largely Buddhist Myanmar governments. It's right that we recognise their suffering on Holocaust Memorial Day, in particular because the deadly Myanmar military offensive against them in 2016-17 has been described by UN investigators as a textbook case of ethnic cleansing with genocidal intent through mass killing and rape. In 2016, the Newcastle Bangladesh Association held an awareness-raising event on the violations of the Rohingya human and civic rights. And this led to a fact-finding trip to Bangladesh in 2017 of local Labour councillors and Muslim leaders, community and business leaders, of which I was a part. We also set up a local fundraising group. During the trip, we were privileged to meet with many people with national and local responsibility for or working with the 700,000 refugees that were there then in Bangladesh, 60% of whom were children. We learned of the huge scale of the humanitarian crisis and all confirmed the horrendous atrocities experienced by the Rohingya people. While there, we went to Cox's Bazar in southeast Bangladesh on the border with Myanmar, and we visited Kutupalong, reputedly the largest refugee camp in the world. Then there were over 600,000 registered Rohingya refugees in the camp. 41% were under the age of 18. Administered by the Bangladesh government with the support of international agencies such as UNHCR, people were provided with some protection, essential services, basic education, and some pretty rudimentary life skill training. But we also visited a makeshift settlement of Rohingya people who were undocumented and so not registered in Bangladesh as refugees. This was really serious for them because without that legal status, they couldn't be in the formal camps and they had no access to justice. So despite the most heinous crimes against humanity that have been committed against them in Myanmar, with total impunity for the perpetrators, they had no formal protection or security in Bangladesh. The site we visited was squalid, a dangerous place, liable to extreme flooding, without any facilities, clean water or sanitation. People's lives were extremely precarious and hazardous, and at terrible risk of life-threatening diseases. Without roads, it was almost impossible for aid to get through, and very difficult for delegations such as ours wishing to document their conditions and also to hear the testimonies of the persecution against them, to also get through. It was very distressing, and for all of us it was very humbling as we saw the huge effort made by families to live with dignity and hygienically under these conditions, and mostly to protect their children from harm, especially the criminal sexual exploitation and trafficking that they were vulnerable to. In both camps, we heard harrowing stories of unfathomable, systematic and routine brutal violations by the Myanmar government. These confirmed what we'd learned prior to our visit, but it was so much worse hearing it from the people themselves. It was just almost impossible to bear, and particularly the atrocities witnessed and experienced by children, things that no child should encounter anywhere in the world. It included the destruction of their villages and homes, the enforced disappearance and murder of large numbers of men and boys, small children burned to death in front of their families, and gender-based sexual violence of women and girls on a massive scale that included rape. So what's the situation now regarding the Rohingya, and how can we help? Well, 2021 marks 4 years since the coordinated violence and persecution of the Rohingya by the Myanmar government and military authorities began. Still, the situation remains an acute humanitarian and human rights crisis for the near million Rohingya living in Bangladesh and those who remain in Myanmar under the continuing threat of genocide. The need for urgent international action is clear. Without it, there are few prospects of a durable solution for the Rohingya people, including their protection from the occurrence and reoccurrence of genocide. Bangladesh, too, is a large, poor country. It can no longer continue to take responsibility alone for the persecuted Rohingyas. Also, as the humanitarian crisis grows, there is a potentially severe impact on the security in the region. Well, in recognition of this, we've expanded our remit as a support group, calling ourselves the Rohingya Action Northeast, RAIN. We have set up a regional basis with national and international links and partnerships. We're now a registered charity and with our own website and online platform for donations to support projects in the camps and outside them. This has included the building of a safe centre for women in the refugee camp we visited. We really welcome new members and anyone who will support our work. There are some hope for the Rohingyas. The growth of groups such as RAIN, it is making a small but difference as we bear witness to the human rights violations and atrocities, and we challenge our own governments. But very significantly too, Rohingya women are raising their voices with men through their own political organisations and networks. They're documenting the use of sexual violence as a tool of persecution of their people by the Myanmar military authorities. And they're also working to change the stereotype of Rohingya women, not just as victims, but showing and celebrating their strength and resilience and the contribution they can make to the different future for the Rohingya people. Finally, it is impossible to overstate the importance of including the Rohingya on Holocaust Memorial Day, calling for justice for the victims of human rights violation, the prevention of continuing genocide, and the recognition of the human and civic rights of Rohingyas. The message to them is profound and clear. Their suffering is not forgotten, nor is it invisible, and their voice is being heard. Thank you so much to everyone for doing this.